Doings of Doyle is sponsored by Belanger Books, home of the best Sherlock Holmes anthologies featuring today's top Sherlockian authors. Belanger Books is the only authorised publisher of Solar Ponds mysteries, continuing the Sherlock Holmes legacy into the 21st century. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com. Welcome to Doings of Doyle, a podcast dedicated to the works of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Professor Challenger, Brigadier Gerard, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. I'm Mark Jones.
And I'm Paul Chapman, and together we'll be exploring Doyle's eclectic bibliography to understand more about the great man's life and work. We'll be discussing his fiction and non-fiction, the well-known and the obscure.
And stopping by Baker Street along the way. You can find out more at doingsofdoyle.com or follow us at Doings of Doyle on Twitter. Hello and welcome to episode 20. This time we travel in the footsteps of one of Conan Doyle's childhood friends to 19th century Japan, where a criminal heist is being planned in Jelland's Voyage. And here's Paul to introduce the story.
In the Japanese treaty port of Yokohama in the mid-1860s, life is an uncertain commodity. Political turmoil and angrily dissident samurai mean the barely tolerated community of Western traders, diplomats and adventurers lead a tenuous and dangerous existence. In this febrile atmosphere, two young British clerks have raided their employers' reserves to pay off their substantial gambling debts. They have 2 months to recoup their losses before the theft is discovered. But then they hear that their boss has returned early from a business trip and announced a snap audit.
Jelland's Voyage was written in summer 1892 at a time when Conan Doyle was really enjoying the fame and fortune from the adventures of Sherlock Holmes, which had just concluded in the Strand magazine. And it was most likely on the back of the success of the Sherlock Holmes stories that he was contacted by an unusual publication, Phil May's Illustrated Winter Annual, to provide a short story. And thanks to Alistair Duncan's diligent work for his book, The Norwood Author, we know a little bit more about the writing of Jelland's Voyage, in that the Norwood News for 27th of August 1892 carried this in its gossip column. Our neighbour, Mr. Conan Doyle, has undertaken to write a story of 3,000 words for Phil May's Christmas Annual. Gossip, which in this case is likely to be accurate, has it that Mr. Doyle is to get £50 for the story. Perhaps this is the largest sum the author of Sherlock Holmes has, during his brilliantly successful career, received for a single short story. Perhaps, too, it is a high watermark in what can only be called the popular value of the English short story. And as Alistair points out, that figure of £50 is significant because it's the same figure that Conan Doyle secured from the Strand to complete the adventures of Sherlock Holmes when he was approached in October 1891. And it certainly sounds like the remarkably accurate anonymous source was Conan Doyle himself, putting about his going rate. What's really remarkable, though, is that it shows Conan Doyle could command this kind of return for a short story that didn't contain Sherlock Holmes. The story was first published in the UK in an unusual title, Phil May's Illustrated Winter Annual, which came out in November 1892. And the commissioner was a British caricaturist called Phil May. He was an interesting figure. He was born in Leeds in Yorkshire in 1864 and started out as a small boy sketching people at the Grand Theatre in Leeds before he joined a travelling theatrical troupe at the age of 15. And then he moved to London at the age of 17, where he had a hard time of it, sleeping rough on the embankment and begging for a living. But eventually he managed to sell commissions to the theatres and picked up work with a journal called the St. Stephen's Review, which was one of the conservative unionist papers where he provided political cartoons. He then moved to Australia, and it was at the Sydney Bulletin that he produced several hundred illustrations before he returned to London 3 years later, back to the St. Stephen's Review, and also picked up work with journals like Punch and The Graphic over time. But the turning point for him was in 1891 when he illustrated a series of articles called The Parson and the Painter, written by the fantastically named Reverend Joseph Slapkins, which really highlighted his ability for humorous caricature. And he had a wonderfully loose style, very playful, with a real economy of words, and he's regarded now as one of the great figures of British caricature, who helped to move the medium forward from the days of Hogarth and indeed Dickie Doyle in Punch magazine in the 1840s and 50s, through to the modern humorous cartoon of the newspapers. Now, the Winter Annual continued to run until after his death in 1904. The last issue was a posthumous issue. And we don't really know what connected Conan Doyle with Phil May, although Phil May was part of that bohemian set and mixed with the likes of Barr and Barry and Jerome K. Jerome, the part of the Idler group, and we'll come back to the Idler in a little bit. We unfortunately haven't been able to see a copy of the Winter Annual for 1892, so we don't know whether or not Phil May actually illustrated the story. His illustrations tended to come between the articles or the stories within the annuals. But we do have a copy of the 1893 one, which features A Memory of the Pacific by Clark Russell, whose fine sea stories were enjoyed by Dr. Watson in The Five Orange Pips. And in fact, the 1896 issue has a Sherlock Holmes pastiche called The Röntgen Raider by Mr. M, which features Shylock Bones. In the USA, Jelland's Voyage first appeared in Harper's Weekly on the 12th of November, 1892. That was Conan Doyle's second contribution to Harper's. He'd previously supplied A Straggler of 15 the year before. And he would go on to supply The Parasite in 1894. In between, Harper's would really go down in history for being the serializer of the memoirs of Sherlock Holmes from January 1893 for the American audience. And for a long time, Jelland's Voyage didn't really make it into a collection. It finally appeared in Round the Fire Stories in 1908, which Conan Doyle said were all, quote, concerned with the grotesque and with the terrible, such tales as might be read round the fire upon a winter's night, which nicely fits with the framing device of the story. And in the 90s, there was a nice little pamphlet produced by Hirayama Yuichi entitled The Annotated Jelland's Voyage, in which he walks us through the history and the background to the story. And that's a great little pamphlet if you can find it. And Yuichi's Annotated Jelland's Voyage has the subheading, The Only Japanese Story Written by Conan Doyle, which begs the question why Conan Doyle chose to set a story in Japan. And for that, we need to go back into his childhood in Edinburgh and his friendship with Willie Burton.
Yeah, this friendship had a curious beginning, really, because William Kinnamond Burton was the son of the lawyer and historian John Hill Burton, who later became the Historiographer Royal of Scotland. But John Hill Burton's sister Mary was very friendly with Mary Doyle, Arthur Conan Doyle's mother. And there was one point in the mid-1860s where problems within the Doyle family, partly caused by Charles Doyle's alcoholism and erratic behaviour, led Mary Doyle to, in a way, almost take refuge in Mary Burton's house. And through the connection with Mary Burton, young Arthur became friendly with young William Burton, who's only 3 years his senior. And they would meet up in John Hill Burton's library, which young Arthur had the run of, which will have helped in his early intellectual development. But yes, the two boys seem to have got on very, very well. And they both ended up following scientific careers. Arthur obviously became a doctor, and William Burton became an engineer. William left Edinburgh Collegiate School in 1873 and was apprenticed to Brown Brothers and Co. Limited, hydraulic and mechanical engineers, also in Edinburgh. And he seems to have done rather well with them. But in 1879, he resigned as chief draftsman in order to enter into a partnership with his uncle, Cosmo Innes, another engineer, designing water systems in London. And this, when he was in London, he actually visited Arthur Conan Doyle when Doyle was in his early days of practice in Southsea and Portsmouth. But the story gets quite exotic in 1887 when William Burton was offered a post at the not long established Imperial University in Tokyo in Japan. This is the period which we'll go into shortly, a period of transition for Japan, where they were really wanting to westernize very quickly and were asking for Western experts to
Mm.
teach their own people. So Willie Burton accepted this offer and went out to Japan and became a professor of sanitary engineering at Tokyo Imperial University. And although William Burton isn't particularly well known in this country, he has left an impressive legacy in Japan, where he is regarded as a founding father of Japan's sanitary and environmental engineering infrastructure. And he was also, interestingly, he was instrumental in the design and construction of Tokyo's first skyscraper, or cloud scraper, as they were known to the Japanese, the Rionkaku, which is popularly known as the Asakusa 12 Stories. Which opened and became a big tourist attraction in 1890. It had Tokyo's first electric lift in it as well, although that became a little bit dangerous and was actually stopped. But it continued as one of the landmarks of Tokyo until 1923, when sadly the top few stories fell off in the Great Earthquake,
Mm.
and unfortunately the Japanese army had to demolish what was left.
And we may have Willie Burton to thank for some of Conan Doyle's earliest ventures into publication, really, because of their shared interest in photography. By 1881, Willie Burton was a frequent contributor to several photography journals, notably the British Journal of Photography, and he was very friendly with its assistant editor. And it was probably because of that friendship that Conan Doyle felt disposed to submit an article to the British Journal of Photography, his first being After Cormorants with a Camera in October 1881. And that was the first of several articles which he submitted to that journal right up till 1884. And during this time, his articles make frequent references to Willie Burton. And similarly, Willie Burton's articles make frequent references to Conan Doyle. So there was very clearly a lively exchange of ideas between them. Gibson and Green wrote an excellent book, The Unknown Conan Doyle Essays on Photography in the 80s. And their introduction covers this in a fair bit more detail.
Yeah, and the photographic connection between Burton and Doyle did carry on for some time, and we know that Doyle's left in one of his letters to his mother talks about Burton coming down from London with a number of characters whom Doyle describes as photographic swells to visit him and talk photography in Portsmouth. But after that time, Doyle's own interest in photography seems to have dropped off, really.
Mm.
But Willie Burton carried on with his interest and took the interest to Japan and contributed to a number of photographic books in Japan. And he was also found a member of the Japan Photographic Society.
And Willie Burton now is little more than a footnote in the story of Conan Doyle's life. He often comes up in the context of The Engineer's Thumb, the Sherlock Holmes story, which was written in 1891, appeared in 1892. And I think Owen Dudley Edwards said that Burton supplied Conan Doyle with authentic detail for The Engineer's Thumb. But there's been so much criticism of the engineering content within The Engineer's Thumb, not least of which disguising a hydraulic coining press within a two-story building that it would be surprising if there was actually some engineering input into the story. But certainly Willie Burton does appear in other Conan Doyle writings. Probably the most obvious direct reference comes in the 1882 short story Our Derby Sweepstakes, in which a character keeps a fish in the house, which creates a horrible smell, which results in her mother writing an indignant letter to Mr. Burton, who had pronounced our drainage to be all that could be desired. But there's also, in the winning shot, Lieutenant Jack Daisby, who had come back from Japan and had brought with him a blood-sucking bat, which terrorized the inhabitants of the house. But the one I really like is Crab's Practice, which is a wonderful comic short story from 1884, in which Tom Crab and a friend, Jack Barton, very close name, are considering how best to drum up business for Crab's new medical practice in the town. And it's interesting that Willie Burton and a friend went down to Southsea to see Conan Doyle in Easter 1883 and stayed at Bush Villas at exactly the time that Conan Doyle was trying to drum up business for his own new practice.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that Doyle puts these kind of versions of Willie Burton into a number of his stories, because we have a letter in existence from Doyle written in February 1884. Where he says, "By the way, Burton, I hear, is writing a novel in which I am one of the principal characters, which I tell him is done in order to make sure of one subscriber to his book." So he knows that, but unfortunately, the novel either was never written or parts of it were written and it's been lost. But he knows that Burton was going to write him in as a character, so it's only fitting that he writes Burton into some of his stories as well. On that point, it's also worth noting that when Conan Doyle's first completed novel proper, The Firm of Girdleston, was published in 1890, it was dedicated to Burton, and under the he wrote the dedication in these terms: "To my old friend Professor William K. Burton of the Imperial University Tokyo, who first encouraged me years ago to proceed with this little story, I desire affectionately to dedicate it, the author."
Very nice. So Conan Doyle clearly owed a debt to Willie Burton, but Conan Doyle also drew on Willie Burton for inspiration for this story, which is set in a really fascinating period of modern Japanese history.
Yeah, it's interesting how Doyle's kind of hooked into this. And you mentioned Owen Dudley Edwards earlier, Mark,
Mm.
in connection to the Engineer's Thumb. And Owen comments of Jelland's Voyage. "It was thanks to Burton that Conan Doyle could set a story in Japan in 1892 and commence it with such assurance, in contrast to the weak settings of some of his narratives of the 1880s in Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa, of which he knew nothing from first hand."
Mm.
So we have no surviving documentary evidence that Burton helped him with Jelland's Voyage, but it seems beyond dispute
Yeah.
that Burton will have given him this background and inspired him, and then Conan Doyle's imagination has has gone to work on this absolutely fascinating and challenging period in Japanese history.
Yes, and this was a period when Japan was coming out of centuries of isolation and now re-engaging with the West.
Yeah, Japan's first major engagement with the West had occurred during the 16th century, when Japan had been absolutely racked by a whole series of interconnected civil wars, which had really begun with the outbreak of the Onin War in Kyoto in 1467, and then just carried on throughout the entire 16th century. In the middle of the 16th century, you've got the Portuguese are the first to really arrive, and they actually bring with them firearms, which the Japanese take to very quickly. And so European advisors are in the background throughout a lot of this period, and this is really when modern Japan is built up by the so-called three great unifiers, Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, and this period comes to a close really with the Battle of Sekigahara in October 1600, which establishes the Tokugawa Shogunate,
Mm.
and this is also the period in which the whole new Japanese government system, worried by the influence of Europeans and particularly the influence of Christianity, decides they want them out. And over the rule of the first three Tokugawa shoguns, Ieyasu, Hidetada, and Iemitsu, you have the Europeans edged out. And there's some final battles just to tidy things up. The siege of Osaka Castle in 1614-15, and the great uprising of Christian Japanese known as the Shimabara Rebellion in 1638. Once they're finished, Japan essentially closes itself off to the world, apart from a few Dutch merchants allowed into the island of Deshima in Nagasaki Bay, and Chinese merchants.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. And this period of isolation lasts until 1853, when a small American fleet of four so-called black ships arrives, commanded by Commodore Matthew Perry from America, demanding that Japan opens up. And this then unleashes the forces which have been held down in Japan for the past 2 centuries plus, And so there's a new period of civil war. There's also a willingness to engage commercially with the West, and to actually realise that the country cannot stay preserved in aspic forever.
And Jellen's voyage is set in the decade after Japan has reopened to the West, and the setting is the treaty port of Yokohama, which was essentially a safe port in which Japanese merchants and traders could deal with traders from the West. It began with the Americans, but then quickly the British, the French, the Germans, the Dutch extended their trading influence into Japan through Yokohama. So tell us a bit more about what happens in Yokohama.
Yeah, Yokohama in the early 1850s is a tiny fishing village. And by the mid 1860s, it has become this major trading port. It's just to the south of what was then called Edo, the capital of Japan, and was renamed Tokyo later in the 1860s. But it becomes this real entrepot where you've got people from all over the world mixing with the locals, and this kind of almost, not quite, but almost lawless atmosphere. You've got speculators, you've got adventurers. I mean, in Pat Barr, in her excellent book, The Coming of the Barbarians, describes it this way. By the early 1860s, Yokohama had become rather like a boomtown of the Wild West, flimsy, raffish, jaunty and harsh, and populated largely by jacks of all trades. Rootless, incurably optimistic men who like to make up laws to fit their own particular needs as they bowled along from one adventure to the next.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the sort of atmosphere you've got in the place. And then you've also got the European diplomats trying to keep some degree of order in these sort of locations, whilst they negotiate with the Japanese government. And the Japanese government is in flux at the time as well. One of our notable diplomats there was Algernon Mitford, who later became first Baron Redesdale, and he was the grandfather of the infamous Mitford girls of the 1930s and 40s. He writes in his memories his first impressions of Yokohama. He describes it this way: the most curious motley imaginable, English, French, Dutch, German, Italian, American, Greek, Chinese, all live together, the most incongruous elements that ever made up a happy family. They are rather a rough lot in some cases, but good fellows enough in their way, and men who have travelled so much generally, besides knowing how to take care of themselves, are helpful and kind to others in a way quite unknown in Europe. So he's got this kind of mixed view towards it. He later, when he moved to Edo or Tokyo, he, like so many diplomats, becomes very snooty about Yokohama and looks down on it. But to those who arrive there in the first place, it is this kind of rather wild, romantic, adventurous place, and it's the ideal setting for this story by Conan Doyle.
Yeah, exactly the sort of setting where this roguish character of Jelland can emerge from. He fits entirely with this kind of background, exactly. And the framing device for this story has the benefit of looking back from a perspective of 20, 30 years since the heyday of the 1860s, looking back somewhat romantically at this period of raffishness and roguish behavior. And you get that sense right at the beginning of Jellen's voyage with the framing device of the clubland scene, where an old Japan hand, one of the Europeans who've been trading in Yokohama from the early days, is looking back fondly on the port and then bringing forward this story of Jelland and McAvoy and what happened. And you have the wonderful clubland setting at the beginning, which would have been very familiar to Conan Doyle, being a serial member of clubs. Douglas Kerr's written extensively on this idea of Conan Doyle seeing writing as a profession, and furthering of his career would have involved him getting involved in many literary associations, things like the Authors Club, which was set up by Walter Besant in 1891, which was an extension of the Society of Authors created by Besant in 1884 to protect the copyright interests of authors. But also Conan Doyle was very friendly with that Idler set that we mentioned before, with Barr and Jerome K. Jerome and J.M. Barrie, who met at the Idlers Club, and it was that club that gave the name The Idler to the journal, which first appeared in January 1892. But it wasn't just literary clubs that Conan Doyle was a member of. He became a member of the Reform Club in June 1892, which had originally been a political club but was now less politically affiliated and had members like Bram Stoker and Henry Irving. And then in 1901, he became a member of the Athenaeum, which could boast former members including Dickens and Bulwer Lytton and Thomas Carlyle, many of his great heroes. And in fact, Conan Doyle's uncle, Dickie Doyle, who'd been the illustrator for Punch, had been a member of the Athenaeum and suffered an attack of apoplexy on the grand main staircase in December 1883 and actually died the next day. So there's some unpleasant associations for Conan Doyle with the Athenaeum. But his most famous club, of course, is a fictional one. It's the Diogenes Club, which is also centred on London's clubland and is home to the most unsociable men in London, including, of course, Mycroft Holmes.
And Willie Burton in Tokyo will have been member of these sorts of sets out there, but obviously there'll be expats. But it's that sort of ring to this story, the framing of Jelland's voyage, of the old yarn, the Clubland yarn, that I've no doubt it's such a shame we don't have any documentary evidence to really go into this, but this is the sort of story that Willie Burton, as someone who arrived in Japan in the later 1880s, will have heard from those old Japan hands who were still knocking about in Yokohama and Edo at this period.
Yeah, it definitely has the air of authenticity to it. And that's one of the things I think that makes this quite an enjoyable story. Particularly, I think that the opening sequence, the description of Jelland's fall is, I think, particularly well done, and you get there's an awful lot of character in those in the few pages in which that aspect of the story is covered.
And that really, again, it comes back to this whole atmosphere of Yokohama at the time. I mean, well, one of the things I found is one journalist at the time writing about Yokohama said, the practice of sending a young chap to Yokohama to sober him up and make a respectable citizen out of him was like sending him to Hades to cool off.
But as well as it being a rogue's paradise, Yokohama was also a place on the edge, and Europeans would be genuinely in fear of life and liberty. Conan Doyle rather simplifies this at the beginning of Jelland's voyage with this paragraph. There was a Tory party and there was a Liberal party among the natives, and the question that they were wrangling over was whether the throats of the foreigners should be cut or not. But that's a massive simplification of what was a really quite complex political situation.
Oh, very much so. As the Western forces moved into Japan throughout the 1850s and 1860s, it stirred up all the underlying political problems that had been bubbling under in Japan during the period of isolation. And essentially the two parties Doyle talks about, his so-called Tory party, they're the supporters of the military government, the Tokugawa Shogunate, the Bakufu, who were in power at that point and had been, since the Battle of Sekigahara. And then the other party, the Liberal Party, were the party who wanted to restore the emperor to become head of state. And perhaps have some form of, not exactly westernized, but some form of parliament to go with that. And the main driving force behind the imperial restoration side it was centered around the southwestern provinces of Choshu, Tosa, and Satsuma, all of which were from families and clans who had been on the losing side at Sekigahara. So this stuff had been bubbling under for many, many years. But you've also got this complicated side of the both sides were a threat to foreigners. Often foreigners were also collateral damage in the fighting between the two parties. But you've got the Shogun side unhappy about the disruption to their government that the incursion of the foreigners has caused. The imperial side seeing the emperor as the son of heaven, and we mustn't have these foreigners interfering in the way Japan runs itself. So it's an extremely complicated situation. And the cultural historian Ian Baruma puts it well when he says the men who helped to bring down the Bakufu were inspired by ideas as well as self-interest. Some were xenophobes, some proto-liberals, and some a bit of both.
Mhm.
And this is what you're both sides. You've got men who are a bit of both. I mean, one of Japan's great heroes of this period, Sakamoto Ryama, was a swashbuckling samurai who changed from being one of the so-called men of high purpose, the shishi, the imperial supporters. He was persuaded that that wasn't the way, and that the way was to go through a kind of not quite democratic process, but certainly a process of having some sort of constitution. So you've got these sort of characters going all the way through who are they're very contradictory characters, and it's an extremely complicated situation. It was genuinely dangerous for foreigners in Japan. In 1862, Satsuma samurai murdered a British merchant, Charles L. Richardson, near the Tokaido Road. In 1864, two British officers, Major Baldwin and Lieutenant Bird of the 20th Regiment, they were both assassinated in Kamakura. And there was also points where Japanese guns would fire at foreign vessels. And you actually get one of these incidents mentioned in this story, the shelling of Shimonoseki in 1864, which definitely gives the historical placement to the story.
And it's the febrile atmosphere of 1860s Japan that really gives Jellen's Voyage its color, because otherwise it's a relatively simple story. It is essentially a kind of heist movie of a sort, in that you get the character of Jelland, who has fallen on hard times, and he's brought with him McAvoy, and they plan to escape with ill-gotten gains when they're about to be discovered. But it's a very strange story too, in that you're never quite sure what Conan Doyle's view is of these two characters. You certainly get the sense that Jelland is this very strong character, and McAvoy is this very weak one. In fact, there's almost the implication that Jelland has almost mesmeric qualities. It says at the beginning that McAvoy was a good boy enough at the start, but he was clay in the hands of Jelland, who fashioned him into a kind of weak model of himself. It may have been animal magnetism or what you like, but the little man could pull the big one along like a 60-foot tug in front of a full-rigged ship. Conan Doyle's obsessed with this idea of people who are mental manipulation, people like Penclosa in The Parasite, or Octavius Gaster in The Winning Shot, or even Bellingham in Lot 249. You get many of these characters reappearing. And McAvoy is this sort of weaker character who gets pulled along in Jellen's wake. But whether or not we're meant to feel any sympathy for them is a bit of a unknown point, really, I think.
Yeah, it's kind of thing where McAvoy is being manipulated. And you wonder how much Conan Doyle's putting in of himself and others he knows. It's interesting that he's called Willie McAvoy, which again I see as another reference to Burton, but it doesn't necessarily mean the character's like Burton. And he's described, as you've just said, as a big man, McAvoy, and Jelland being the smaller man. But there's also a description of McAvoy's mother as being
Yes.
this kind of little old lady in a white cap, which is just like you'll see photographs of Mary Doyle. He's almost describing his own mother here. There's lots of kind of complex stuff, I think, getting mixed in here. But ultimately, McAvoy is certainly not a Conan Doyle self-identification, because he's seen as a bit cowardly. And it's interesting with Jelland and McAvoy to think whether they're sympathetic characters or not, to think about what's brought about their downfall, which is actually addictive behaviour, and gambling in particular. And in the story, we're told that it was gambling that set Jelland wrong. Every night in the week, you would see him in the same place, on the left-hand side of the croupier at Matheson's Rouge et Noir table. And it's interesting to think about this addictive behaviour issue. because of Conan Doyle's father being an alcoholic, we do get quite a few references in his work to alcoholism. And gambling in this case, Jelland is obsessed with it. It's addictive behavior again, and it's, is he in control of himself? Do we sympathize with his addiction? Is Doyle again thinking about his father and how in these sort of circumstances you're not entirely in control of what you're doing?
Jelland probably needed McAvoy to lock up his checkbook in his desk.
Absolutely, yes, it might have helped. Not add his own checks to the pile.
Yeah, and it leads us to one of the most peculiar things about the story. And I personally find it not that satisfying, which is the ending. In that, I think the first 3/4 of this story are great in the historical setting and the building of the characters of Jelland and McAvoy and what is happening between them, and then we get their attempted escape. But it might be that the conventions of the heist movie are so well formed in our minds now that actually this story doesn't conform to it for very good reason that it predates. So this isn't like the League of Gentlemen with Jack Hawkins and Dickie Attenborough, or even the Italian Job, where you've got time to build up sympathy for the characters, even though they're wrong-uns, and then you feel it when they don't get away with the spoils at the end. In this, they're much more negative characters. Either Jellen's intensity or McAvoy's weakness.
And it's also with the ending, and I don't know whether this is because of the Japanese setting. I don't know whether it's meant to reflect a kind of samurai way out.
That's
At
a
the
good
end,
point.
this almost, they've been in Japan for so long, they've almost taken on a Japanese mentality.
Yes. Yeah. That's an interesting point because I read it almost as being a story about defeatism again, which is something that Conan Doyle plays on later in A Pot of Caviar in 1908, which is a terrific story, also set in the East, which is the Boxer Rebellion, and concerns the fate of a group of Europeans who can hear the Boxers approaching their compound, and is very much a case about, don't be so defeatist in the face of this. But these characters are different. They're bad uns from the start, and in a way, the story might be better if the whole character of McAvoy and the relationship with Jelland were played out a bit longer, as though maybe McAvoy, who's been pulled along with this, is going to, could in some way turn the tables on Jelland, so that he maybe gets away with the bullion instead, and Jelland disappears over the side. There's something not quite right about the end of this story. I think it doesn't quite hang together in this case.
Well, where it does, it certainly really does resonate with Pot of Caviar in terms of the ending this is darkly ironic.
Oh yes.
And the ending is, and again, this is maybe, I don't know, a sort of some of Conan Doyle's reading of Japanese legend or myth or whatever he may know of it, but the futility.
Yes.
It's this futile gesture. It doesn't need to happen for any reason at all, whether to evade capture or the fact that the moment it happens, they could have got away. It's just, it ends on this note of utter futility.
Yeah. And it ends also with some dead bodies aboard a ship disappearing off into the distance, because that's another Conan Doyle trope that we've mentioned before. And also, reminiscent of another legend that Conan Doyle was very closely associated with, the legend of the Mary Celeste.
And you've got that, again, directly referenced with the name of the yawl here being the Matilda.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously we also have in the Sherlockian canon the Matilda Briggs, which is a direct reference to the Mary Celeste case. So his interest is there all the time.
Yeah. And Japan does appear a couple of times, if fleetingly, in the Sherlock Holmes stories. But the reference that's quite a sad one in its own way is the reference in The Dying Detective to the Black Formosa corruption. In 1896, Willie Burton had moved to the main island of Taiwan, which at the time was known as Japanese Formosa, and he returned to Japan proper in 1899, but he had become seriously ill, and actually he died of a liver infection not long afterwards. So there's quite a sad connection to the Black Formosa corruption in that respect. That might well be one of the possible Sherlockian connections here.
And another fleeting reference to Japan occurs in the Greek Interpreter, when Mr. Milas is taken to the mysterious country house, and says, "I caught glimpses of velvet chairs, a high white marble mantelpiece, and what seemed to be a suit of Japanese armour at one side of it." And it's interesting that Doyle brings in Japanese armour here, because it's so different to European armour, and in this context, it really adds a touch of what you could call Oriental Gothic
Yes, absolutely.
into the picture. I mean, you if you read Algernon Mitford's descriptions when he's first out in Japan, he sees the samurai in armour, and he describes them as almost like demons and hobgoblins,
Mm.
because it's just so weird to the Western eye.
Mm. Yes, it's put in there to
Mm,
be another signifier,
mm, mm,
unsettling signifier in
mm.
a particularly unsettling scene, actually. So Conan Doyle is using Japanese references to add colour and flavour to his writings, but he was by no means the only author of his day to be influenced by Japanese culture.
No, there was a real craze for what became known as a Japonism in Western culture, once Japan had been opened up, and awareness of Japanese cultural and artistic styles began to seep into the European mentality. You've got it at an artistic level. With artists like Vincent van Gogh, James Abbott McNeill Whistler, Aubrey Beardsley in particular was
Mm.
very influenced by Japanese print designs. But you do have it in other forms as well. It enters popular culture. 1885, Gilbert and Sullivan produced The Mikado, huge success. Not quite at the same sort of sophisticated level as Beardsley, perhaps, but very much showing how the Victorian public were interested in this rather exotic, strange country, strange culture. And there's later on, it's a Europe-wide thing, at a different level to the Mikado. You've got Puccini's Madame Butterfly, which was premiered in 1904. And that in itself was based on a short story which had been influenced by the French writer Pierre Loti, the great French writer, Orientalist, romantic. He'd written a book called Madame Chrysanthème, which transmuted itself into Madame Butterfly later
Mm.
on. And Loti had written two other books in what became known as his Japanese trilogy, Japonerie d'automne in 1889 and Le Troisième Jeunesse de Madame Brune in 1905. So this is really going throughout the culture. But the other thing that really took off was an interest in Japanese folk tales and myths and legends. And the first to really kick this off was our old friend Algernon Mitford,
Mm.
with his book Tales of Old Japan, which was first published in 1871, where he'd translated a number of old Japanese legends, and he also added in some of his own experiences. He was the first man to popularize in the West the legend of the 47 Ronin,
Mm.
but he also put into this book an eyewitness account of his own of watching the ceremony of harakiri. Um, but other writers also took up this whole theme. So you got books like Walter Denning's Japan in Days of Yore in 1887, F.H. Davis's Myths and Legends of Japan in 1913, and in a level of his own, you've got the Irish American writer Lafcadio O'Hearn, who also worked in Tokyo's Imperial University. But two of his collections, absolutely wonderful writings, In Ghostly Japan, 1899, and Kwaidan in 1904.
And back in the world of detective fiction again, you have figures like Arthur Morrison, the author of the Martin Hewitt series of detective stories, was an expert on Japanese and Chinese paintings. And Yuichi tells us in his annotated Jelen's Voyage that collection was actually dedicated to the British Museum. So, what's your final takeaway on this story then, Paul?
It's a fascinating story. Very interesting that Conan Doyle has picked up on this particular period, and as we've discussed, this is probably because of his association with Willie Burton.
Mm,
But it's quite amazing, really, when you look back at this period, why more sort of adventure writers and so on didn't set novels and stories within this world, because there's so much going on, and you think of the popularity in the 20th and into the 21st century. Certainly, the popularity of the samurai in Western culture, and the influence of kind of samurai ideas and samurai culture in a lot of Western popular fiction. It's interesting that Conan Doyle is one of the few of his era to pick up on this. We've got plenty of reminiscences of people who were out there, but not much in the way of fiction.
mm. Yeah, and I was kind of left wanting more really with this short story in the sense that the setting is so interesting that you could see a whole range of things spinning off. I mean, it's very hard to do anything. It's very hard to achieve what Conan Doyle is able to achieve in 3,000 words, but you feel there's so much more that could be gone into. And certainly when he's writing about Jelland at the gambling table and the context of Yokohama, it's a very rich picture. I think it starts to peter out somewhat towards the end, which is a little bit of a shame. But you know, I would have loved to have read more of what Conan Doyle had in mind for the adventures of a whole range of characters in this setting, because you could just see how this would be a really rich world with a whole range of roguish and raffish characters to enthrall and excite.
Yeah, you could see something along the lines of kind of Thomas Burke's Tales of Old Chinatown in London, or Arthur Morrison's Stories of the East End.
Mm,
This kind of thing could easily have been developed, set around Yokohama in the 1860s.
mm. So that brings us to the end of Jelland's Voyage. If you'd like to read the show notes, you can find them at doingsofdoyle.com. And if you'd like to support the podcast, then consider leaving a rating or review at your podcaster of choice, or you could become a patron at patreon.com/doings of Doyle. So, Paul, what have we got on the podcast next time?
Well, we've been talking today about Conan Doyle's interest in photography, and we'll be going into photography again with the next show, where we'll be discussing the Cottingley Fairies case with Dr Merrick Burrow of Huddersfield University, curator of an exhibition on the Cottingley Fairies at the Brotherton Library in Leeds.
Excellent. Really looking forward to that. So, join us next month for our interview show. And until then, it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
Goodbye.